Well, bombshell news out of Europe today. Newly leaked phone call logs show that European leaders are actively trying to thwart peace plans in Ukraine. Of course, they're bloodthirsty and they absolutely want war with Russia directly. A confidential call between European leaders and Ukrainian President Zelensky has leaked to the German newspaper Der Spiegel. They got their hands on it. The phone call was a setup to Zelensky, and they tried to warn him that the United States may betray Ukraine's interests in upcoming peace negotiations with Russia, basically lying to Zelensky, saying the U.S. would basically throw him under the bus. So go ahead and basically continue this war. According to the leaked notes, Emmanuel Macron warned that there's a possibility that the U.S. will betray Ukraine on the issue of territory without clarity on security guarantees, calling the situation a great danger. Friedrich Merz, for his part, on the German side, reportedly told Zelensky to be very careful, accusing U.S. envoys of playing games in negotiation. There's a whole bunch of other individuals on this call as well, from Finland, Mark Rutte, the NATO Secretary General, and other EU leaders. In other words, don't listen to the Americans. Listen to the trustworthy European leaders instead. Dr. Olga Ravasi joins us now to break this all down and also talk about the preemptive attacks that NATO seems to be planning against Ukraine or against Russia as well. Doctor, great to have you back on the show. Great to see you. What do you make of this Der Spiegel article, and why are we hearing about this now?
Good to see you guys again, and thank you for having me. Yes, I saw the article and saw several other international media outlets carry this. And look, at this point, I don't think that calls like this get leaked accidentally. I think this is a message that they're trying to send to President Trump first and foremost, and also to President Putin, to warn him that these negotiations must include not only Ukraine and the little dictator Zelensky or wannabe dictator, but the unelected bureaucracy and some of the elected leaders of the European nations who have been on a suicide mission for quite some time and have been shooting themselves in the foot, first and foremost economically, with all of their green agendas and all of the lunacy that they have been ushering and imposing on their own people. But they are trying to insert themselves into these negotiations because they realize that they are being sidelined, and rightfully so, because it is clear to all of us that the main decision makers on this will be Russians and Americans, meaning President Putin and President Trump. One thing that I thought was very interesting while President Putin was meeting with Jared Kushner and Witkoff, at the same time, Secretary Lavrov was meeting with his Chinese counterpart. So you imagine these bilateral meetings that are kind of ushering your multipolar world. Whether we want it or not, it is emerging. It is already actually here. And it is very clear what the lines in the sand are. It is China, Russia, and the United States. So, of course, the Europeans would want to play, a little part in this, but they're simply incapable because even their economies cannot sustain this. And back to NATO, I mean, what are they really thinking they're going to keep sending to Ukraine? They're completely depleted. They've got nothing. And they've been telling us all along that the Russians are running out of bullets. And they want to keep the racket going because, again, let's go back to the history of NATO a little bit. NATO has been obsolete for quite some time since the collapse of the Soviet Union, since the collapse of the Warsaw Pact. NATO basically was deemed useless. Well, how did NATO reinvent itself? Through the war in former Yugoslavia, through the balkanizing of Yugoslavia, and through the bombing campaign that they unilaterally conducted against Serbia and Montenegro at the time. And that happened without the UN approval, the Security Council or approval, and it happened against the will of the American people as well, because we didn't have the congressional approval to go into such a campaign. So NATO has been, as we used to think of it, a defensive alliance. NATO has been incredibly aggressive and has been serving as an extended tool of the global empire, if you will, global American empire. But what I'm also concerned about is that this is an offshoot of the global British Empire, because while these meetings have been happening in Russia, while the Europeans are leaking the calls with Zelensky to send a message to President Trump. I don't know if you guys caught this, but at the Windsor Castle, King Charles had a banquet with the German Prime Minister Merz. And interestingly, at these banquets, geopolitical things are seldom discussed openly. What King Charles said was a stern message, at least as far as I'm concerned, which was that the Anglo-German alliance will stand opposing Russia and continue standing with Ukraine. So what does this tell us? All of these meetings are actually a threat to, let's say, hundreds of years of the extension of the British Empire, which has used the United States basically as its tool and has used us as foot soldiers to accomplish their goals, financial, military, globalist, etc. So I think they are panicking because they are realizing that President Trump also knows that there are three superpowers emerging, and those three superpowers are going to be making those decisions. And one other thing, who is going to be the adult in the room to stop NATO from this suicide mission? It has to be President Trump, because let's face it, who's paying for this? Who's footing the bill? We are, and President Trump needs to be very stern and put a stop to this.
Now, recently, Mark Rutte, the head of NATO, says that NATO is on track to spend over $1 trillion per month. $1 billion per month in 2026 to supply weapons to Ukraine. They don't have that. So what is that going to do to the Euro? So they're pretending that they can come to the high rollers table on this idea that they need to fight a war. They are not fighting the war. The war is not in Europe, not in NATO countries, and they're not. So it's like a cosplay. It's like war costume party. It's so dumb, but it will hurt the European people to do this, and the United States by extension, because we are still part of NATO. So what are they playing at?
Well, so they're playing several things. And let's face it, NATO and the European bureaucrats and even President Trump's administration is still surrounded by some of these neocons, by some of the people who are part of the swamp, who continue to be part of the deep state. And they funnel money into NATO, and they funnel money with their, buddies over at Mossad and CIA and BND and MI6. All of them are continuing to cosplay that Zelensky is somehow going to be victorious, but just keep sending us more money. The victory is around the corner. Just keep doing the racket over and over again, because again, war is a racket. And all of these people that are running the show are benefiting. But one thing that has to be made clear is, if you look at the world currently, every single point globally that is at war is bringing about torment against Christians, and most dominant in that being Orthodox Christians. When you look at what is happening with Russia and Ukraine, I mean, these are two brotherly nations, essentially. And President Putin is very strategically precise about how they are conducting this special military operation, because we must remember that this war didn't start a year ago or 2 years ago, or with the beginning of the special military operation. This war started again with the American bureaucrats and European bureaucrats assisting Maidan in 2014 and handing out muffins and croissants while Ukrainians were being killed and sniped, and while Maidan was going on. So this has been happening for quite some time. And back to our European friends and NATO friends who keep now saying, well, we cannot redraw maps of Europe. Well, let me remind them that they actually unilaterally bombed a country in the heart of Europe, Serbia, to redraw maps of a sovereign country, internationally recognized sovereign country, taking away Kosovo from Serbia. This is a precedent that they created, that now President Putin is using legitimately. Let's compare it to Crimea. Well, they're saying there's no comparison. Actually, there is. In fact, there was no referendum in Kosovo. Crimea had a referendum, and over 90% of them voted to join Russia. President Putin realizes that eastern part of Ukraine is essentially Russian-speaking population, and they are one way or the other going to bring about their target mission to the end the way they want to bring it about, which means they may go all the way. I was looking at the reports. They are closing in on Pokrovsk, which is a major downfall for Ukraine and for NATO, because again, this is a proxy war for NATO. They are closing down into the shores of Dnieper River. That's as far as they probably may go. They may go close down into Odessa, creating a landlocked country out of Ukraine, and then leaving the western part of Ukraine to the rest of the Europeans to split apart. They'll leave it up to the Poles, to the Hungarians, because all of them, in fact, have some interest in that part of the world. So as you said, yes, NATO continues cosplaying, but I find it interesting that Germany is doing this insane game, because Germany, their situation is coming to a halt. AfD is rising in power. And interestingly enough, I was talking to my friends from AfD a couple of days ago. Their peace plan that they proposed not too long ago is very similar to this peace plan that President Trump proposed. So there is an emerging nationalist, conservative element of Germany that understands very much the continental power alliance between Berlin and Moscow, which is a major threat to somebody like the British Empire or London, again, being the naval power. So there's a lot at stake here, but I think President Trump will be working closer together with his Russian and Chinese counterparts, because look, the Russians would want to hand him some sort of a win, like a foreign policy win, if they could. But it's a matter of what's going to happen with Zelensky and how the Europeans are going to push this. But I'll tell you, Zelensky, Merz, little Macron, they're all dead men walking. If you remember during World War I, Europeans used to say for the Ottoman Empire, it's the sick man of Europe.
Right.
And then the Ottomans got kicked out. Well, right now, the unelected bureaucracy of the European Union and NATO, they are indeed sick men of Europe.
Dr. Olga Ravasi, always great to have you on the show. Always walk away learning a number of things. So thank you so much for your insights on this, and we'll be watching as Europe tries to, wrestle its way inside of these negotiations as best they can.
And ultimately wake up and free itself from the bureaucrats, because Europeans truly need a rude awakening.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Dr. Olga Ravasi, thank you so much for joining us. Hope you have a wonderful weekend as well. Thank you so much. Great to see you.
Thank you, guys. Same to you.